And the Department of Agriculture says the severity of the El-Nino-induced drought will impact negatively on crop yields. South Africa's 2023-2024 summer grains and oilseed production are likely going to fall by 21% year-on-year to 15.2 million tons. Joining us now is Dr Sifiso Ntombela, advisor to Agriculture Minister Togo Didiza. Doctor, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. How do our crop production outputs get determined? And is South Africa likely to survive the next El Nino cycle?
Good afternoon, Ms. Chavan. Good afternoon to your viewers. Thank you for having us. So South African Department of Agriculture and the agricultural industry as a whole, they've put in systems in place which monitors the level of production in the country as well as the demand, both in terms of what we export internationally, what we consume domestically, as well as in the region. So in terms of plantations, what we do is that it's a group of experts from the industry and government in the constitutionally formatted forum, which looks at the planting during the start of the season and look at the yields in terms of modeling, and they determine what can we expect in terms of the crop, which is what we call the crop estimate committee. And on regular basis, monthly, they release then the estimate of what we can expect or not. Above that, we also have what we call the supply and demand estimate committee, which basically look at the demand level as well as the supply level and try to measure and see whether the country is safe or not. Now, based on these information systems, what we know based also on the weather is that on what has been planted, we're likely going to be able to be 21% down year-on-year in comparison with last year because of intensity of heat that we've seen, particularly from January and February, which has damaged some of the crop. What is promising is this morning the minister and the captains of the industry were looking at this data and looking at inventories that it seems the weather patterns is not uniform across the country. There's some areas that are significantly affected, some areas are not necessary. But in the region, like if you're looking at in Zimbabwe, Zambia and other countries, it seems to get worse. But what I can say is that when you're comparing all the data set that we have, we can say with certainty that South Africa will be able to meet its domestic demand for food in this summer crop season based on what we expect as crop, as well as the reserve that we have from the previous season, which is sitting in our silos. What might be a challenge is our level to export into the regional markets, as well as the international market, which might be affected in the near term. Okay.
You mentioned Zimbabwe. Now, just this week, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa declared his country to be in a state of disaster as a result of drought. He says that his country needs $2 billion of aid as a result. Is there any concern that perhaps later down the line, South Africa will find itself in the same position?
What we have looked at, it's certainly not in the foreseeable future what we could find ourselves in that situation. I think we're still at a very better position than that. And what is even more promising is that from the Weather SA projections, we are likely to start seeing better conditions, or not as worse as we've seen in the past 2 months, which might bode well for our winter crops. But also what we have done is to ensure that the government, together with the industries, you start putting measures in place that will safeguard the production and ensure that business continuity, particularly of farmers, is retained and ensure that the industry is in the safe position. So when we even looking at the previous levels from our lessons, which we were at a far worse situation in the 2015-2016 season, Maschaba, is that we are much better off than that period. So it has not gone to that level. And there's a likelihood that the weather might not be as bad going forward in the country. So those are some of the areas that shows that South Africa might necessarily not be in the worst case, which basically is a message that we're starting to also share with the public as well as the citizens, that they might not need for panic. What we need now is to ensure that the market is operating on very accurate and timely information so that there are no violations as well as price escalation that might not be just.
All right. And Doctor, is the department actively working with agri-producers on navigating the next few years?
Mr. not only just the captains of the industry, as I said, this morning the minister was in the engagement with different industry of captains, not on the grains and the oilseed side, but also on the animals as we're building up to the winter. We know that feed becomes an important part of our animals. 3 weeks back, the minister also briefed the cabinet, where also was engaging with the different line departments like the Department of National Treasury, which will also then upscaling our engagement with the financial institutions, so where those farmers that might be in distress level could then be assisted in terms of looking at how they can service their loans better and ensure that this business continues. So there's that coordinated now approach both in government together with industries, but also another very critical stakeholder which tends to be affected during this drought level is the farm workers, and what measures it's needed and how do we safeguard those that might lose their job as farmers lay off their employees to ensure that their well-being is also taken care of.
And while we often consider crops when it comes to drought, as you've just indicated, Doctor, livestock are also affected. Can you tell us more about whether there are concerns about how livestock will be impacted beyond this potentially rising cost of feed?
So when you're looking at the livestock, and there's a very close integration between the grains and the livestock, because basically most of our livestock, when they get to a certain stage, they go to the feedlots and they get to be fed by our maize. What we at least seeing some encouraging development from this statistic is that within the maize, it seems the challenge is more on the white maize, not necessarily on the yellow maize, or at a lesser extent to the yellow maize. But what will then be encouraging is that even those crops on the white maize which has been impacted, farmers have already started harvesting those and putting it what we call silage, which basically becomes a feed that is saved and preserved for the natural nutrients that the animals will need in winter. So there is also a focus in terms of farmers being encouraged to harvest hay as well as different feed components so that their animals, when it gets into winter, they can have sufficient nutrients to maintain their well-being. But also some of the small-scale farmers which tend to be more vulnerable into these harsher conditions is that they are being encouraged to sell some of their animals so that they can preserve the revenue and be able to buy them when the environment is conducive in the future. We're putting also some of the infrastructure in the rural areas and in the tribal areas to assist farmers to be able to participate in the market, and those that can have assistance in terms of conditioning their animals so that they can be better accepted in the market and get better revenue. So all those are part and parcel of the engagements that were taking place this morning, which will then be upscaled and be monitored by a dedicated industry and government team that will be looking now at these implementation measures and seeing some of their impact in terms of mitigating, ensuring that there's a softer landing of as many as possible farmers with against this impact of drought.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sifiso Ntombela. Thank you for your time. So he is the advisor to Agriculture Minister Togo Didiza.